we go. Hopefully everybody can see this this screen. So I have been working for this company for a number of years now. I've been involved with a background in electronics, got involved in this company in 2006, and I've been working ever since then on broadly micro renewables. So a bit of wind in the early days, kind of small and sort of, big domestic scale, I think most people would consider it. And increasingly so solar. We also were certified for heat pumps for a number of years in there as well. So good background of these technologies. And then over the last probably 5 years or thereabouts, electric vehicles were starting to become a really big talking point as well. And so I've been driving electric for a good number of years now, since the end of 2016. So not really an early adopter, but early-ish. So kind of getting into it from a renewables point of view, as well as them just generally being better than internal combustion engine vehicles, in my opinion. So anyway, that's a bit about my experience. The thing that blends everything together at the moment is battery storage, and that's really the kind of emerging technology that's kind of new compared to the rest, which is a little bit more established. So let's go. So this is a slide I just shoehorned in here a few minutes ago to hopefully help our journey through tying all of this technology together. So we can kind of broadly consider some of these devices as consumers, some as generation, and some as a bit of storage and time shifting. So all of this is sort of equally relevant to each of you individually. You'll probably have a slight slant on which direction you'd like to go down. But as I say, they all mesh together. So it's nice to have an understanding of how they all work together. If you get that understanding, you can then modify that to suit your own circumstances. So broadly, consumers, so things that consume a lot of energy, such as heat pumps. So if you're heating your entire house or premises using electricity, you're going to consume a lot more electricity. So if you take a look at, for example, if you're on mains gas, you'll be able to see on your bills the number of kilowatt hours, or if you've ever had an energy performance certificate, for example, done, you'll be able to see the number of kilowatt hours that you'd expect to require to heat your home. So heat pumps use a lot of electricity, but they work very efficiently. We'll come a little bit back to the technology of heat pumps in a bit. Electric vehicles, you'll see that I've actually got this in both the consumption and the storage and shifting box, because they kind of serve lots of purposes in this context. And let's not forget our domestic consumption as well. So traditionally, a house would consume an amount of electricity. So obviously, if we're working on making things electric, which have previously not been electric, our consumption is going to change, and importantly, the pattern of that consumption as well. The generation side, so solar PV is probably the most commonly used one. We'll come back to that in a bit. And I've also mentioned wind. I've put hydro in here as well. It's not particularly common in a domestic setting, but worth just being aware that generation can be quite broad. If you can make electricity, then we can find a use for it. And then the storage and shifting. So that's really the kind of bit that sort of meshes all of this together, is being able to store in various forms. So whether that be on four wheels on your driveway, as heat in a hot water tank or similar, or as in a battery that we can use for whatever afterwards. And of course, time of use tariffs. So we'll cover the time of use tariffs last. It's really important as part of this. If you have some or all of these other technologies, time of use tariffs is what makes it all really work really nicely together. So why are we trying to use electricity for things? So electricity is pretty clean, and we have the means to make it even cleaner than it is already. If we are burning fossil fuels, so LPG heating or kerosene heating, mains gas heating even, if we can electrify that, we have scope to make that as clean as clean as we want it to. Fossil fuels are fossil fuels. I'll not labor too much over that point. So electricity in Scotland and the UK in general is really clean, and there's loads and loads of additional renewable generation coming online. Renewables tend to have the main problem with renewables is that they are intermittent to some extent. So naturally, when it's windy, we generate lots of electricity from wind. So we have to use it. The grid's a balancing act. It's a constant balancing act between supply and demand, and that has lots of impacts on cost and how much renewables is allowed to be generated and consumed on there, and that's all part of this puzzle as well. Microgeneration slots into this this cleaning of the grid effect as well. If we can generate electricity locally and consume it locally, it means there's no transmission losses associated with getting that from generated in a power station somewhere all the way to your premises for you then to consume. So electricity can offset pretty much everything around the house, as kind of noted here. So these kind of main points of transport via vehicles and heating, the big ones. A couple of graphs here. I tend to get a bit hung up on graphs, as you'll see a little bit later on, but I like these ones anyway. So here we are. So this is Scottish Government data. I think they published this. I'm not sure when, but these are the latest ones. This larger one towards the bottom of the slide, and its predecessor from the previous year up above. So the headline figures to me are the 74.6% in 2018 of gross electricity consumption came from renewable sources, which is pretty impressive. But then we can see that in 2019 that went all the way up to 90.1%. So that's really exciting figure, I think. So the target was to be at 100% of gross electricity consumption from renewables by 2020. So the data, as far as I can tell, hasn't been published for that yet, but I'm sure we'll hear about it when it is. And that's really cool. So the kind of caveat to this is gross consumption. So it doesn't mean that 100% of the electricity that we consume in Scotland comes directly from renewables, so from hydro or from a wind turbine. It's that we are generating this and it's getting used somewhere in the UK or getting exported to Europe or whatever. So what we need to be able to do is, via a mix of all these technologies, is make better use of renewable resource when it's available, and that will get the net renewable consumption up. So in other words, making use of the resource when it's available. So let's kind of move on through the blocks that I put in. So the generation. So this is probably the simplest bit, but it's worth just covering, just so we're all on the same page with this. So solar PV, standing for photovoltaic, is the production of electricity from what are broadly known as solar panels. So they're quite handy because they're accessible to lots of people. So they're getting a bit cheaper, which means that if you've got some roof space or some ground space available, we can see a couple of images here. So one's actually a system from maybe 2008 or 9, something like that, about 4 kilowatts or 3.8 kilowatts, something like that. And then I think this is a 9 kilowatt ground mounted system from a year or so ago. So and can go bigger, smaller, anywhere in between. So it's very flexible, modular. But what's changed over the last few years? So some of you might be familiar with the Feedin Tariff scheme. So that was the method of funding solar PV installations by paying you for generating electricity. That no longer exists. So the way to make the financial bits and pieces stack up, not that that's the most important thing, but it tends to be important that it makes some sort of sense, is to self-consume as much of the electricity as you generate as possible. And that's both good environmentally, because you're hopefully offsetting other fossil fuels with that, but you're also saving on your electricity bills, which is a bonus. So in doing that, we need to generate electricity when we need it so that we can so-called self-consume it. So you can see in this sort of summary here, it's pointing us towards having a large system so that we then have a mixture of spare electricity in the summer and perhaps the shoulder months, and hopefully something tangible in the winter as well. So that's particularly relevant when we come to trying to offset heating loads. I'm sure it goes without saying, the heat demand in the winter is high when the solar generation season is the lowest output. So we'll keep coming back to that, I'm sure. And then a brief summary of heat pumps. We actually gave up our certification for heat pumps a few years ago now, so I'm a little bit out of touch with the technology side of it, but the concept remains the same. So we use a heat source, so whether that be ground or air. So the bottom of this slide here shows an air source heat pump. So it looks like a air conditioning unit. So it basically takes outside air, which has some heat energy contained within it, and the compressor system, the heat pump system, steps that up to so-called high-grade heat, which we can then use to heat space and hot water. So the key thing here is that heat pumps, if they're designed and installed properly, crucially, is that they can be really very efficient. So anything from 200 to 400% efficient, depending on exactly what they're doing and the outside temperature and so on and so on. So that's really important if we can get kilowatt hours, so units of energy for free, for nothing. So especially if we generate that ourselves and then we suddenly triple what we've generated by putting it through a heat pump to offset our heating demand. So this is the complicated, though I think a little bit easier to get your head around. So an electric vehicle obviously serves two purposes in this context. One, it's a vehicle and you can use it to go places, which you probably do anyway, if you own a car. The other job it serves is storage. So vehicles tend to have quite big batteries in them by just about any count. So usually, let's say, between about 40 and 100 kilowatt hours worth of energy. Number's not too important here, but let's pretend that's a large amount of energy storage. So what that means is that we can use that as somewhere to dump spare electricity when we have it. So the two times we're likely to have spare electricity is in the summer when we've got lots of spare solar generation, perhaps in the winter when we've got lots of spare wind generation, or from the grid. So we can use the best times to consume electricity from the grid. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. If we can charge the car from local generation, we're obviously doing that both environmentally well and also for essentially zero cost, which is nice. And then let's come on to static storage. So I'm going to mention heat storage here. It's not always the best way to do it, especially in the context of heat pumps. So as we spoke about, the heat pump will take 1 unit of energy in and output 3 units of heat. So if you're trying to store that heat, you suddenly need to have the capacity to store 3 times as much heat as you do electricity. Now, there are various ways to do that. If you've got a huge shed and you can put a big tank to store lots of hot water, fine. But in most people's domestic context, storing large amounts of heat is either problematic or expensive. So I've actually got a picture here of a nice Scottish product called Sunamp, made by Sunamp and based in McMurray. I think they are. It's known as a heat battery, which there's funding available for. I'm sure we'll talk about the funding a little bit later on. Essentially, it's a means of storing heat energy other than just a tank of hot water. A nice bit of kit. So I mentioned the product called Eddy here. So Eddy is a proportional controller, and it's basically a smart device which spots when we have excess local generation. So whether the house be satisfied and you start exporting from your solar PV, instead this device grabs that and diverts it via a heater. So usually an immersion heater in a hot water tank, or in the case of the Sunamp heat battery, inside the Sunamp, and it changes that electricity to heat. So the downside to that is once it's heat, it's pretty much can only be used as heat. Whereas with electricity storage, you can use electricity for all of these things that we're talking about and more. So a few kind of bullet points here, which I won't labor over too much. So the downside is that the technology is relatively expensive. So it's a bit of a talking point in the industry at the moment, because everybody's seeing that batteries are getting cheaper. So largely because of electric vehicles and production ramping up and so on. But we're not really seeing that reflected in the battery storage. So let's refer to them as home battery storage market, because they're not just a battery. There's a lot more to it. So we need to be able to get energy into and out of that battery, and we need to have a suitable control system to do that correctly. And if it doesn't do it correctly, either the battery is not going to last very long, or you're just not going to get very good results from what you expect just to magically soak up all your spare generation and then feed it into the house. I'll cover a little bit more on the technical side on the next slide. But the nice thing about batteries, as well as being able to use the electricity for lots and lots of different things, is that we can use that in its various methods of operation to offset the dirtiest of grid electricity. So it's a buffer that we can use to prioritize and keep things as clean as possible. So this, if battery storage is something that you're interested in, instead of me prattling on for another hour about battery storage, I'd recommend looking up, or I can send a link or whatever for this document here. It's actually quite old now. I think it says 2016 on there, but BRE, the building regulations people, made this document that covers loads and loads of information about battery storage in this context, and a bit of off-grid stuff as well. But it's really important, if you're going to spend the amount of money that these battery storage systems cost, it's worth knowing exactly what you're getting yourself in for, and why some are more expensive than others and set up kind of differently from each other. The warranty is probably the biggest thing in this sort of product. More from I guess environmental point of view, if you want it to last quite a long time, because there's obviously resource goes into making these batteries, though they are fully recyclable pretty much. Though if you spend that amount of money, you're going to want to last and perform for a long period of time. So that's probably my personal take on if you're comparing different battery systems. Warranty's a really big one. But from a technology point of view, getting it to do what you want. So a good control system, able to produce, so charge or discharge powerfully enough. So in other words, be able to grab all of your spare solar, not just a bit of it if it can't charge fast enough. And if you turn on a high power device like a kettle or a, electric cooking, for example, some batteries aren't capable of discharging fast enough to feed that demand. So the power input and output is crucial to not just the financial, not just the environmental, but also the satisfaction you get out of having these battery systems. So I put a lot of weight on power as well as the warranty, as I say. This is an installation example. So this is to kind of highlight how modular these systems are. So you can see 2 solar inverters and in fact 2 Tesla Powerwalls here. So there's I think this is 10 kilowatts. It's 2 5-kilowatt inverters. Actually, there's a 10 kilowatt inverter that does the job of both of these two now. Technology moving on even just from a year or two ago, this system. Maybe 2 years or so now. And we can see here there's 2 Tesla Powerwalls stacked to give 27 kilowatt hours of storage. So the average UK consumption's about 6 or 7 kilowatt hours a day. So you can see that's a fair amount. And 5 kilowatts. So that's how fast these batteries can charge and discharge. So a total of 10 kilowatts there. So we can see that in some respects that's a nicely balanced system because we have 10 kilowatts worth of solar generation power capacity, and if there was nothing on in the house, we can send all of that into battery for use later. The plastic covers on the front one here, this was before we revealed it to the customer so that he could peel off his wrapper for his nice expensive battery system, which is why it looks a bit funny there. So yeah, this final piece of the puzzle. So the seasonal differences is probably the place to talk about this. So in the middle of summer, so if we've designed a solar PV system to be on the larger side so that we've got spare generation and tangible amounts of generation in the winter, the summer and the starts, the kind of summer side of the shoulder months is probably okay. We're going to be pretty much just self-consuming, sometimes via the battery, sometimes directly, even if we're doing all our heating electrically with a heat pump. But as we tend towards winter, we'll rely more and more on the grid as we have less and less solar generation and more heat demand. So what we can do if we've implemented all this technology already is leverage these so-called time of use tariffs, both to improve the financial case, so we can pick and choose the cheapest electricity available. But the nice thing about it is that the cheapest electricity tends to be the cleanest electricity as well. So the wholesale price of electricity essentially, there are lots of factors, but essentially fluctuates based on how windy it is and how much of our generation is from renewables. So we can see broadly on that, I'll talk a bit more about what this graph is in a minute, but we can see there are very high spikes here. So this is pence per kilowatt hour. So we can see that there are lots of spikes here. I think this is like last week's data or something. Tail end of January. So we can see these big tall spikes up to 35 pence a kilowatt hour is very expensive. So they are 4 to 7 p.m. So that's when the wholesale price is at its highest as a result of supply and demand. So the grid demand is at its highest at that time, and therefore we tend to be burning most fossil fuels to meet that grid demand. So the wholesale cost goes up. This particular tariff is actually artificially boosted up at that time as well in order to encourage you to reduce your grid impact at that time. So this is part of the way that we get around people saying, oh no, we can't have electric cars because everybody will get home from work at 5 o'clock and plug them in. And the way we stop people doing that is making people alter their habits, and we can use technology to do this, alter their habits to avoid the dirtiest, most expensive electricity and make the best use of the cheapest, cleanest electricity. So you can see the electricity cost went down to only about 7p, which is actually quite expensive for this tariff from last year's data. The electricity tariff's been, wholesale price of electricity has been quite expensive this year so far for various reasons. So long story short, if I can try and do such a thing, is we can grab these low spots, charge our home batteries with them, charge our electric vehicles with them, and use that to offset the dirtiest, most expensive bits via the battery. That's the theme of it. Then the flip side is to let somebody else do all of this for you. So there's a couple of kind of commercial setups doing this, broadly speaking, this sector. So grid services. So I'm going to talk about the Tesla Energy Plan because it's the one that I know most about. So as a Tesla Powerwall owner, you can enroll in this tariff, which has a 0 standing charge and 11p for import and 11p for export. And then what you do is absolutely nothing. You just use electricity as you want to use electricity, and somebody else will automatically be operating your battery to support the grid, in essence. So it will tend to charge from that cheap, clean electricity that there's a surplus of renewables of overnight, and use that to then discharge the battery into the grid and physically export to the grid to improve the grid, reduce demand on the grid, and somebody else, so in this case Tesla, makes some money out of that, and you just don't need to think about it. There's some people like to engage with the tariffs like on the last screen, and operate their batteries to get the most out of it and the lowest cost. Lots of others like to just have the battery and get the technology to work for them in a tariff like this. So that's a kind of another side to all of this, is just thinking about it as more distributed use of self-consumption. So obviously your solar still counts towards this. You still get all the benefit of your solar, but the grid does as well via your battery. And we'll talk just briefly about some overlaps that don't necessarily work. So let's take the circumstance where people are out at work, so they commute to work and take the car with them, and it's not plugged in at home. They have lots of spare solar generation, so they go, right, I'm going to get a solar battery, charge that up from the solar during the day, come home and charge the car from it at night. So it's kind of fine. It works a little bit, but it's not the most efficient way to do it, because you're having to charge the battery, discharge the battery, and you've got some losses associated with that. And then you don't have the energy in your battery anymore to use in the house, and you're also a bit limited by the capacity of the battery. So it's one of these crossovers that people tend to think is like the holy grail, exactly what they want. But in reality, unless you don't drive very often, it's or not very far, then it's probably not going to work very well. And that's when the time of use electricity tariffs and charging from the cleanest grid times is better. So I warned you about graphs, so I'm not going to labor over these too much, but this one here broadly shows us, so the big red block here is a electric car charging just at relatively low power, so about 3.5 kilowatts. This is actually in our offices in Ayrshire. So this is me getting into the office and the car sort of trickle charging at 3 kilowatts or so, just as a little top up. We can see that increasingly so over the day, towards midday, the solar is making a dent in it. So this blue colored is self-consumption. So that's going directly from solar into the vehicle and the office. The green bit in this context with this technology, as we have installed at our office, is the battery charging. And then we can see towards the right and the left-hand sides of the graph, so we can see that the battery is feeding the demand. So the office is actually also a house. So we can see that the battery almost charges fully back up again, and feeds the house overnight. So this is quite an old system now. So this is actually a Tesla Powerwall 1. So it's about half the capacity, and it can only do 3.3 kilowatts worth of power. So we can see this spike at about 6 or 7 o'clock there. And the battery's not able to keep up with that. Tesla Powerwall 2 at 5 kilowatts is going to import far less electricity at that high peak, because it can keep up with the demand. Here's another slightly different example. So in this case, we've kind of done it the other way around. So we've got the battery supporting the solar. So the car is coming in and charging in the afternoon this time. So we're outputting full power from the battery and the solar, and minimizing that import. But what we can do instead of sort of manually controlling how fast the vehicle's charging and when we start it charging to capitalize on solar, by using automation. So there are lots of products to make lives easier, including this device here. So this works in the same way as the Eddy product. In fact, it's made by the same company. So it grabs spare generation when other devices. So, for example, if there's a battery and a Zappi or other smart EV charger, it waits for the battery to charge, because we can usefully use that as electricity to power the house, and then we can take any spare beyond that and charge our vehicle with it. So here's another graph. It's a different format from one of my customers with lots and lots of monitoring kits. So we can see the yellow here is the solar generation, and the orange is Zappi ramping up and down the power to basically match the total site consumption to the solar generation. So the net effect of that is that you're using all of the available solar energy. So we can see Zappi does a really nice job here. We can come back to these if any of you are particularly interested. And getting on for finally, so this puts a bit of put some pound signs in front of things. So this is one of my customers who's actually since had a heat pump installed. So his bills look a little bit different to this now. But we can see on the left-hand side here, we've got this is a screenshot from the Tesla Powerwall app. So we can see over this broad time period, we can see that he's used 345 kilowatt hours in the house, and only 28.5 of that was from the grid. So we can see in April he's doing really pretty well, and that's covering all of his household consumption and his electric car charging, and I think all of his cooking at this time as well. Had a gas boiler at this stage. But then if we go over to the right hand side here, we can see that he's actually consumed from the grid just 17.7 kilowatt hours over this 2 or 3 week period. And the average cost of that, crucially, is 7.97 pence per kilowatt hour. So this is with the battery leveraging. So when this is a kind of shoulder month, so it's sometimes charging from the grid at off-peak rates in order to make that average electricity cost as low as it possibly can. And the net effect of that is that the bills are nice and low. So lots of talking about technologies and what they do and how they sort of mesh together there. Ultimately, though, there's a reason why we're doing all of this, and why I get quite so involved in it, and that is to kind of continue and encourage this trend to electrification, and on top of that, making the electricity grid for everybody else who's not able to, or isn't quite so nicely placed to to invest in all this technology for now, to help the grid get a bit cleaner. That's why we're doing all this. That's why all these technologies are kind of coming out. So the nice thing worth being aware of, that I'm sure our colleagues here will keep everybody right on, is the funding for all this technology. So personally, I like the current setup is everything's really done by interest-free loans, which is a nice way to do it. It takes the sting, particularly out of the technologies that are still quite expensive, so the electric vehicles and the battery storage. It takes the sting out of the high purchase cost of some of this. And certainly the way I think about it, for the solar and battery storage, for example, it's essentially pre-purchasing electricity, so that the loan repayments effectively replace your bills. So obviously it depends on exactly the context, but that's the way I like to think about it anyway. So I think that just about covers everything that I wanted to try and explain. But yeah, let's do some questions. Hopefully you've got some good ones.